You can get Sons of Patriarchy completely ad-free on Apple Podcasts for $4.99 per month or $44.99 per year. This applies to our entire back catalog and every upcoming episode completely ad-free. Listening without interruption. If you don't mind the ads, you can still listen to the series for free on any of your favorite podcast platforms. This revenue helps support Outreach Idaho and helps pay the bills of the series. Now, on to the episode. Quick announcement before we start this episode. We've launched our website and initial line of merch. Go to sonsofpatriarchy.com and pick up a t-shirt, a sticker, or a crew neck fleece, or all three. And wait till you see our design. We went bold. A link to the website is in our show notes, or simply type sonsofpatriarchy.com into your search bar. Now, on with today's conversation. All right, we have our first in this series of the Covenant Presbyterian Church denomination, abuse stories within that denomination. And we have our first woman who's coming on to talk about what has happened to her, what has happened to her family. So if you can start off by introducing yourself and moving into kind of the broad approach, because you didn't start off CPC. I know this is on the front end. You started off in sort of a sister denomination, the CREC. So introduce yourself and then kind of how you got into this mess in the first place.
Yeah, so my name is Gabrielle Beam. I did start I grew up in the CREC for a short time. When I was 7 or 8, my family started attending a CREC church in Phoenix. Sadly, after a few years, there was a church split. I don't really know what it was about. I was only 11 or so, but my now husband was there. We've known each other since we were kids. And from what my husband knows of the split, part of the congregation wanted to go more PCA, and a small contingent of families, mine included, wanted to go more fundamental, more conservative. So after the split, we had a long period of time visiting other churches, trying to find somewhere to join. But eventually, we decided instead to start our own CPC plant. It was the first in Arizona. We wanted a church more in line with what we believed, and so we became a CPC plant. We were under the leadership of the CPC in California, under the eldership of Steve Walker and Bill Hine. From what I remember, they were nice guys, nice families. Bill Hine preached for us regularly and administered communion. Other CPC pastors from around the country also came and preached for us from time to time. That's actually when I met R.C. Sproul Jr., when he visited, I was maybe 12 or something, and it felt like a celebrity was staying with us. I thought he was so cool, nice guy, good preacher. Although many years later, I became close friends with one of his daughters, which is when I learned a lot more about him from her perspective. When I was 13 or 14, my family visited our friends in Tennessee. They lived in a small, unincorporated town out in the country, about an hour west of Nashville, in the absolute middle of nowhere, and we attended the CPC church with them just down the road, called Heritage Church, led by Elder Marion Lovett. And we fell in love with it. We ended up moving out there when I was around 15, and I really felt that God was calling us out there. It was a single elder church for a long time. Marion was the only elder. And for just a quick look at his background, this is just from the website. He has an MDiv from Bob Jones University. He then planted a church in Atlanta, was there for about 10 years or so, and then he eventually moved to rural Tennessee. If I remember correctly, I believe some of those Atlanta families moved with him. Like, he wanted to move the church out of the city, and so a contingent of families moved together from Atlanta to Centerville, where he was the sole elder for many years. Eventually, another guy from the church became an elder as well. His name is Keith Bradshaw. I forget what year he was ordained, but for a long time it was just Marion. I was very happy when Keith joined as an elder because even as a teenager, I knew it wasn't great to just have one guy in charge of a fast-growing church in the middle of nowhere. As for what it was like, on the surface, I loved the community. I had many friends. I loved the weekly liturgy. I loved the depth of theology, and the music and singing was really good. I myself am a violinist, so getting to play for service each week was really cool. I loved getting to use my musical abilities to contribute to the service. On a deeper level, though, now that I look back on my time there, it was pretty spiritually discouraging a lot of the time. The subjugation of women is really strong. There's also just so many rules, spoken and unspoken. For example, skirts or dresses were the standard for women at all times. I mean, I grew up denim skirts all the way. If a girl was to wear jeans, like for playing outside, or sometimes we'd play frisbee or something, the expectation was that she wear a tunic to ensure that she was completely covered. Like wearing jeans wasn't enough. You had to be further covered with a tunic or a long shirt. Makeup was pretty minimal. There was definitely a little judgment if you wore a lot of makeup. Same thing with jewelry. Marion's wife actually doesn't wear jewelry beyond a wedding ring for church, and maybe earrings. And there was this one time that I asked her about why she doesn't wear jewelry for service, and I can't remember exactly what she said, but it was something along the lines of just not wanting to distract from the service. Just in general, there's just so much focus on our sin and how we're failing as a society, and so we need to be, rising up in our convictions, and there's so much emphasis on total depravity and how we need to be doing better, how we need to be better. And as I got older, I always felt like a failure. I felt like I could never really measure up or be worth anything. And as I grew older, the idea of marriage also grew less and less appealing. I was taught that as a woman, I do not have freedom outside of a man, whether that was my father or future husband. I was taught that submission to a man was my lifelong calling. I was taught that it was decreed from creation, and at no point would I have autonomy. Even if I were unmarried at 40, I would still be required to submit to my male authority and live under his headship. I know I'm not the first one to say this on here, and like many others, I was taught that my ultimate purpose in life would be fulfilled only as a wife, because my main calling was to be the subordinate helpmeet to my future husband. In no way could I truly fulfill God's purpose for my life except through marriage. I was taught that my lifelong calling was to be a wife, to submit, express no disagreement, care for the home, have kids, provide my wifely duties in the bedroom. No boundaries or exceptions should ever be considered. I'd like to read an excerpt from a Sunday afternoon Q&A from January 2021. Marion says, quote, "A woman's identity is inseparably tied to man. Her purpose, her design, her role, her function in life are all inseparable from man, whether it be husband or father." End quote. And at a later segment, quote, "Apart from man, a woman does not have a clear identity or role to fulfill." End quote. Then, from a Bible study on headship, this was a few weeks later, this was February 24th, 2021. The minute mark of this recording is 1 hour, 8 minutes, and 18 seconds. Marion says, quote, "I made a statement, had a lot of pushback, that a woman's identity is inseparably related to man. That's a foundational, fundamental principle and truth. And I do want us to get that without inserting a lot of the problems that may be associated that we might think of today. There are lots of problems, I grant you that. There's lots of issues with men mistreating women, and there's lots of women today who do not have heads." End quote. And about 20 minutes later, he's in the same headship study, he says, quote, "There's always headship in every relationship. We are all under Adam, and we're all under Christ. Every one of us have a covenant head, and we are all in him. So by the virtue of what our head has done, we either are suffering from it or we benefit from it. Right there is the framework that you can throw out every bit of individualism, your independence, your independent mindset, all the applications of your individuality, just throw it out. It does not compute with a covenant relationship, end quote. So, to your question of what it was like, I find this teaching so dangerous and hurtful because it really taints the way we should view God, relationships, and marriage. It certainly has for me. It's tainted my view of God's love for me because by this description, I have nothing and am nothing outside of a man. By that description, God has no love for me unless I'm with a man. So anyways, as a 19-year-old, the idea of marriage sounded pretty depressing. Not because I didn't want a husband, but because being a wife, as was defined by the elders, just sounded miserable. And being a woman, I knew it wouldn't be okay for me to continue to pursue my career as a musician or as a teacher or to pursue higher education. And so I decided that I wanted to remain single. I preferred it because it was better for me to stay unmarried. I'm very thankful that my dad gave me agency in life. He was not an oppressive patriarchal type. He had no problem with me working, even working an hour away in the city. He had no problem with me pursuing my own musical interests. And as a single woman in my dad's house, that was way more aligned with what I wanted for my life. But I felt guilty because I was still being told that God's will for me was different, that my place was at home. The message running through my head was that I was failing to honor God's will for me as a woman, and I truly believed that I just didn't have the submissive and obedient heart or countenance that I was supposed to have. And that was tough, because I knew deep down that I didn't fit the mold. I knew that I was a rebellious woman who couldn't just submit quietly, and I felt hopeless. This is a slight side tangent, but when I think about the way marriage is taught at Heritage, I just wonder how much potential there is for better, closer, stronger relationships between couples. But they're not taught that. I truly believe that God wants more for us, but the people are not taught that. They're not taught how to put each other first in a healthy way, in a sustainable way. There's no emphasis on communication or boundaries or mutuality. Marriage is only ever framed as authority and power, domination, and submission. And I'm not saying that every marriage there is abusive or toxic. No, there are some good people there. I just think there's a huge opportunity for better, healthier marriages, but it's just not being talked about. Anyways, back to your question of what it was like. I mean, I understand the appeal of places like this. I get that there's something kind of grounding about this fundamental conservative culture. I get that it looks good. It looks like stability. It gives the appearance of order and community and structure. But for those like myself, born into this and raised in this harsh and strict environment, I can attest to the absence of freedom. And as a young woman, I did not see God's love for me, or his kindness, or his desire for me, or even the value of my life as a single woman. My value and even my salvation was only in relation to a man. And to this day, the hardest part of untangling this web of lies is finding God's love for me. It is a daily struggle for me.
Yeah, thanks for sharing a lot of that background, and I am 100% sure that many other women are going to find themselves in your description at this church, in their various churches, whatever it may be. So now, specifically on the CPC, on Covenant Presbyterian Church. So you came from the CREC, the Communion of Reformed Evangelical Churches. I'm pretty sure it was still called that maybe it was called something different when you were a kid. What were your first impressions of CPC? And if you can also talk through having grown up at both with your more recent memories being at the CPC, what's distinctive about the CPC that may be different or aligned with the CREC as well?
I don't know as much about the CREC theology to provide a good juxtaposition.
So what's distinctive? What's more particular? What's distinctive about the CPC? What is the CPC like? What's their bread and butter?
Yes, no, it is very similar to a lot of other denominations, and but I think the CPC really has its own flavor.
Mhm.
I remember thinking that the CPC was the best thing ever. Like once we started our own plants, I really thought we were doing it right. I loved the theology and everything, and I really thought that we were the only ones doing it right. So so this is what I know. The Covenant Presbyterian Church, or CPC, is a very small denomination. I believe there's only 12 churches in the US.
There's 12 churches in it. So
Okay.
I don't know what's considered micro, but it's pretty darn near a micro denomination. It's very small.
The CPC doctrine, in a nutshell, is viewing Scripture through the covenants, and it views the covenants as the unifying element in Scripture. So the belief is that covenant theology gives understanding to how Scripture is unified, and it aids in the practical outworking of doctrine. The biggest display of this is lived out through the family structure. So at the top, you have the man, or head of the household. He is supposed to know the will of God and lead his family. He's supposed to consistently instruct his family from the Scriptures and lead them in family worship. However, the role of women is quite different. The women are supposed to come alongside as a companion to her husband and help him in his calling and ministry. And all of this can be found on the Heritage website too. It's not, you don't have to dig.
Not secret. Yep.
It's right out there. As for the women, it's believed that because woman came from the man, she has purpose and fulfillment serving that which she came from, the man. Now, they're always very clear that they're not really saying woman is lesser, but rather the different functions of the genders. That's always highlighted. Marion says, quote, "The headship of a man in the home is absolutely essential to the manifestation of the glory of God in the home," end quote. The headship thing goes pretty far. Marion has also said, this was during a wedding, during the sermon, he said straight up that a wife is never to rebuke her husband. Another illustration used a lot is that marriage is like a dance, like a tango, because one person has to lead. You can't both lead. The man has to take the lead and the woman has to follow. And she's forced to follow because if the man steps forward and she doesn't step back in response, she'll get her toes stepped on. There was one instance from the pulpit. This was during a sermon on marriage, I believe. I remember Marion told all the couples that when they were in bed that night, before going to sleep, the wives were to look at the husbands and say, "My Lord." And the husband was to respond with, "My love." I was very uncomfortable after he said that. I was like, hell no, that's weird. Another display of the authority and submission dynamic was the required head coverings.
Required. So it's not optional or like most people do it. It is, this is what you have to do.
Oh, well, it's not really required, but if you don't, yeah.
Gotcha. For sure.
Yeah. I wanted to bring this up just because every female wears a head covering. Like, if she can walk, her head is covered during the service. At least that was the case while I was there. Marion has a document on the Heritage website regarding head coverings. One of the opening statements is, quote, "The purpose of this pamphlet is to explain a doctrine that is largely lost in all but a few churches today. Because of the influence of our culture upon the church, the infection of the women's liberation movement into the church, and other variables, today's church has excused, ignored, and sidestepped the teaching and practice of head coverings for women in worship," end quote. And later he says, quote, "If we can step back before the time that the women's liberation movement has so overwhelmingly infected the church, we shall see testimony of the commonly held position of this passage throughout church history," end quote. I think it's interesting that he uses the word infection twice in regards to what's happened with women and the church. I just find that interesting. Now, again, the message is very clear that men and women are equal. They always preface with that. But then it always goes on to emphasize the distinction. The belief is that through our distinctiveness, God is glorified. And this is displayed through the use of head coverings for women. From the document again, quote, "The woman dishonors her immediate head, which is her husband, thus dishonoring her ultimate head, Christ, as well. For a woman to fail to cover her head in worship, she would bring shame upon the man by breaking down the distinctions of the male-female relationship," end quote. And one final point from the document I wanted to read, quote, "The head covering is an outward, visible distinction that all can recognize and acknowledge that the woman is not ministering in the same degree as her male counterpart. That is, her head covering indicates she is under headship and is not ministering with the same authority as the messengers present," end quote. So yeah. Back to the family structure, though. For the children, I will, again, read a quote simply because it paints the clearest picture. This is from the website. Quote, "It seems that most homes in America tend to revolve around the children, their activities, and their desires. Our children have learned to become consumers in the home and society and not producers. We now think that our children are the ones who need to be served, coddled, appeased, and entertained. This philosophy has dumbed down the church in its doctrinal understanding and has produced entertainment-driven churches. Children will find their identity and satisfaction not with a group of peers in youth group, but serving Christ in the home and church," end quote. And at a later segment, quote, "If the children are segregated from the rest of the church service, playing games and watching films, enjoying puppet shows and having refreshments, then they will have missed the grace offered in the instruction to the church," end quote. A few years ago, I read Darby Strickland's booklet called Domestic Abuse, Help for the Sufferer, and she talks about how oppressive people make relationships a place of domination. They have an inflated sense of self-worth, and they feel they are owed preferential treatment and unwavering allegiance. Oppressors oppress because they have an entitled mentality, and this comes from an inflated sense of themselves that allows them to justify mistreating others in order to get their demands met. And sadly, that's what I see at Heritage. From what I've observed, I think the expectation to participate in the service puts a lot on the younger kids and the moms. Children are expected to sit quietly for hours. I do mean hours. And the moms and dads have to keep them quiet and entertained, which means there isn't much of a break for the moms ever. They don't really get time to worship or to spiritually rest each week, because they're busy trying to get the kids to sit still. They're either nursing infants or taking the toddlers back for spankings, and they're not given an opportunity to be spiritually refreshed. By way of example, this is what every Sunday looks like. There is a 9:30 a.m. prayer service. 10:30 is the worship service. It goes for about 2 hours or a little more. Then there is a weekly potluck lunch, followed by a 2 o'clock service, which is either a Q&A or hymn sing or a lecture teaching. And there's sometimes a nightly potluck dinner and fellowship at 5 p.m. So it's a pretty full day. And there's definitely an unspoken expectation for you to attend all of it. So yeah, that's the CPC in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's all. That is a lot. So having been there for as long as you were growing up, after the CREC, when did you first, so this is all the theology, all the background, all the kind of the cultural stuff going on. When did you start noticing things like, hey, there's some things here that aren't great, whether it be with your family and the way your family is treated, or the way it was treated in the church leadership or under Marion? When did you first start questioning, maybe this isn't a healthy church?
Mm-hmm. I guess it began when abuse cases started popping up. I started to see how the session handled it, and it just got worse and worse each time. I was seeing a pattern of turning away those in need and really screwing people over, men, women, and children. And the tipping point for me leaving Heritage was in 2022 when they barred, when they barred my friend from the table, and they did so for unbiblical reasons. And what that did to her was devastating. And that's when I decided to leave.
So how was with when you started questioning and decided to leave? How, if you can describe, so it was not handled well. What does not handling well look like from Marion, from Harvest, CPC, and We'll talk about other CPCs, assumedly later on, with other people as well, but particularly at Harvest and under Marion.
Mhm.
What did this look like, mishandling abuse cases?
It's called Heritage.
Heritage.
Yeah.
What did this look like at Heritage?
In regards to my own family and the ongoing issues between family members, the session just never really did anything to help us. We never had a single pastoral visit in the years I was there. They never expressed concern or sympathy, at least not to me. I felt very alone as we were trying to navigate a lot of difficult familial situations. Overall, there was just a huge lack of shepherding, despite the obvious issues we were having as a family. Another situation was with a young woman with 2 small children. Her story is not mine to tell, but as I became a friend to her, I was privy to the abuse she and her children suffered from her husband and even his extended family. I even witnessed some of the abuse. As she sought help at Heritage, the session gave her pretty minimal support. They had a lot of expectations for her. For example, she had to get a job basically right away at a local fast food place. They put her up in an apartment, but only for a month or so. After that, they withdrew that offer for her to stay in the apartment because she wasn't meeting their expectations with financial, like working a job and following their guidelines or whatever. And so she was forced to move back in with her husband. She kept telling me that she couldn't have her kids sleeping in the car, and so she moved back in with her abuser so that her children could have a roof over their heads. During the time that she was living back with her husband and the abuse was escalating, the session merely encouraged her to be patient and to submit to her husband's headship. And they encouraged her husband to meet with them for lunch to kind of like mentor him, but from what I remember, I don't think the husband was a Christian, so he never showed up. He didn't really have any interest in, Christian mentoring or counseling. So sadly, that whole situation didn't really go anywhere. It didn't magically get better, and so she eventually left. In the case of my close friend, Alexandria, who I believe is one of the women you'll be speaking to, when she was 23, she left her abusive family in Phoenix and became my roommate in Tennessee. My father was working to protect her from her family, and he was kind of in negotiations with her father. I guess you could say that she sought refuge with us during that time. She went to the Heritage Elders and asked for church membership, which they didn't really answer at that time. Then the session started getting involved with her family situation, and because they believed that she was subverting the headship of her father, again, she was 23, they were really putting pressure on her to repent and submit to her father. She tried to explain the abuse that was taking place, but they weren't really doing anything with that information. One thing I do want to add is that I was a witness to her father admitting to the abuse, but when she told the elders about it, they dismissed it, and they never reached out to me regarding it. During that whole time, Marion demonstrated on multiple occasions just how uneducated he is on matters of abuse. For example, he told Alexandria that, I'm paraphrasing, he said that victims always know in the moment that they're being abused. They just know when it's happening that it's abuse that they're experiencing, which is simply not true. And on another occasion, he kind of gave this overview of his ministry experience, and he kind of used a handful of generic examples of how he's been standing in the gap for domestic violence victims for 25 years and how he knows domestic abuse firsthand. It felt like he was trying to convince us that he knows what he's doing, but actions speak louder than words. The session continually dismissed and invalidated Alexandria's abuse and repeatedly called out her shortcomings and accused her of being manipulative. They put such a high expectation on her to be the bigger person, to be perfect in her response, and to be open and forgiving towards her family. But if they're going so far as to make a big deal out of her behavior, why didn't they equally make a big deal out of what her family was doing to her? At one point during the whole proceeding with her family and everything, Myself and other close friends were encouraged. I think we had received an email from the session. We were encouraged to attend the congregational meeting that Sunday. And at this meeting, the session instructed the congregation to remain neutral in the whole thing. They spent a long time talking about how the situation was so complicated and how only the elders knew the full story, and so no one should make any of their own conclusions because the situation was just so far over our heads. But I was one of the people closest to the situation. I did know the full story, and it's not complicated because regardless of what the session said, I was on my friend's side. I was not going to stand neutral between her and the abuse she suffered at the hands of her family members. It was not complicated. It was simple. I chose to stand with the one being abused, and the elders chose differently. So eventually she left, as did I, after they barred her from the table. That was the last straw. There are many stories, plenty more, but these examples are the ones that I was more privy to. In the end, I personally felt that I had to leave after seeing Marion and Keith repeatedly neglect the broken and wounded, the orphans and widows, and ignore those in desperate need, myself included. You know, God says that we can lean on him. He doesn't require us to first get our shit together in order to be worthy of his help, and the same should be said of the church. God gives out of the abundance of his love. He delights in helping us. He delights in blessing us. Jesus and his disciples went above and beyond to minister to people, and we should too. I believe that ministering to people in need is a privilege. It's an honor to sacrifice my time, my energy, my money, my sleep for those in need, because that's what Jesus did. I'm not saying that churches should just freely give handouts or whatever, but churches ought to have a true heart for people in need without judgment. And unfortunately, the lack of shepherding and structure at Heritage left the session in a continual state of making it up as we go type behavior. The church should not be putting high expectations on victims of abuse. They should not be dismissing their pain. They should be comforting them as Jesus comforted those around him. And it's really sad to see such coldness from these men who claim to be messengers of God and who claim to care about their flock.
Well, thank you for that. So you have already talked about multiple women who are coming out and talking about the Covenant Presbyterian Church, about Heritage, CPC, about Marion Lovett, and I'm assuming when this comes out and others come out, we will get more stories about Marion and others in the CPC as well. So those who are either still in this denomination or this particular church, or those who've left it with similar stories to you, what do you want those listening, wherever they may be, and again, particularly to those who have a similar story or haven't spoken out yet, what do you want them to know about the denomination, about the church, and about the pastor?
It's difficult to answer this one concisely, so I apologize in advance. When I was a teenager, I heard that there were rumors in town about Heritage being a cult. And as I was very enmeshed in Heritage at the time, I never believed the claims of it being a cult. I was 100% certain that it wasn't, because, it's just a close, loving community of Christians who all believe the same things. And I think for the folks that are still there, in a way, for them, it is a close, loving community. But for those who don't fit the mold, for those who've stepped out of line or maybe have had a difference of opinion, it's a different story. Because once you start asking questions or saying that you disagree with something or saying that maybe, just maybe, there are other options out there, then all of a sudden you start hearing the don't gossip reminders and the you're causing disunity amongst the brethren, or the you're being divisive with your words. That's when you really start to feel the constraints around you. And all of a sudden, it's like you're standing in a small circle or something, and you've been told not to move an inch. And apparently you've been standing here in a tiny circle this whole time. And so for those that are in that circle and are happy with it, to them it's not a cult. But for those who've stepped outside of the circle and questioned it, that's when you start to see the many displays of cult-like tendencies. Sadly, for those who've left, the narrative is framed in a very misleading way, in my opinion. And I can say this because I am one of those that have left. The blame is always put on those who've left, like, well, those people just didn't, whatever. They're just going their own way. Or those people are falling off the wagon. They're walking away from the true faith. And to this day, I think critically of myself, thinking like, well, a bunch of other people haven't had any problems. No one else struggled to submit to their church authority like I did. Everyone else conformed. So what's wrong with me? There's so much emphasis put on unity in the body. Unity on primary, secondary, and tertiary issues. Everyone looks the same, acts the same, lives the same, has the same beliefs, and you can't disagree. You can't have healthy difference of opinion because that's divisive. Unity to the point of uniformity. And I think it's a huge red flag to be in an environment where you can't disagree. And after everything that happened with Alexandria and when they barred her from the communion table, I was talking to friends about maybe going to the presbytery or something, but then I realized there's no point because the other members of the CPC are of similar minds. They're not going to think that much differently. And Heritage is one of the more highly esteemed CPCs. It's grown in number by a lot. It's actually grown so much that Heritage is now spending millions of dollars building a massive church building out in the country. There was one time that Marion told the congregation that we can't or shouldn't let the world see our sin, and we shouldn't admit our mistakes as a church, because then the world will see our mistakes, and that would be a bad representation of God and the church, and it's bad for the image. I knew in that moment that he was wrong, but I still felt this fear of like, oh no, what if the world sees the church mess up? And I just want to take a minute to mention the book Bully Pulpit by Michael J. Kruger. It's a great book. Cannot recommend it enough. Well, in the book, he quotes John Chrysostom. I don't know if I'm saying that right.
Chrysostom, yep.
I wasn't sure if I
got it.
did that. So the quote is, Christians damage Christ's cause more than his enemies and foes, end quote. And it's so true. In chapter 2, he talks about helpful terms that can be used alongside spiritual abuse. Those terms are heavy shepherding, authoritarian ministry, spiritual oppression, and heavy-handed leadership. All of this is spiritual abuse. And at a later point in the book, speaking on churches with significant patriarchal tendencies, quote, these churches often have a severe top-down male authority structure that is not to be questioned or challenged, especially by women. These church cultures create an ideal environment for spiritual abuse, end quote. And another quote, the abusive pastor might be convinced he is building God's kingdom, not his own. In his mind, he is so significant to the work of the kingdom, so important, so valuable that he feels justified in doing nearly anything to keep the ministry on track. If people get run over, then that's because they got in the way of the great kingdom work he's doing. Collateral damage, so to speak. In a sick, twisted way, he is crushing people for the glory of God, end quote. The author puts it very well, in my opinion, and sadly, that's what I see at these churches. And that's what I would hope that people would hear, that this is the reality. Isaiah 5:21 through 23 says, woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and shrewd in their own sight. Woe to those who are heroes at drinking wine and valiant men in mixing strong drink, who acquit the guilty for a bribe and deprive the innocent of his right. I would now like to share an audio clip of Marion from a Sunday afternoon in 2021.
In fact, I will say this, that the session of Heritage will not tolerate any real abuse, biblically defined, physical in nature, We will protect females from male abuse when it is truly abusive. But we're not going to jump on the Marxist bandwagon agenda that supports the whole underlying theology of the feminist theology that everybody is abused and everything is abusive. We're not going on that bandwagon. You can take the Bible and you can show me and we can understand the nature of that abuse, but today we're coming out with labels like emotional and mental and spiritual abuse. By the way, I have heard now for the last decade those particular triage of abuses: mental, emotional, spiritual abuse. Have you been abused? Oh, absolutely. He hit you? No, nothing like that. Touch you in any... No. Spiritually, emotionally, mental. That's how I'm abused. Don't go talk to my wife or my daughters, because I bet you they could probably chalk up every single day of their existence something where they've been mentally, emotionally, and spiritually abused. We're not going down that path.
There was a comment on Sons of Patriarchy I saw a few months ago. It was something about how this podcast is doing a bad job because it's just one side of the story and how it's not like sharing the other side of the equation. But I just want to say this is the other side. These oppressive authorities have set the narrative for decades, and we are the other side of the story. For so long, there have been people going to the church for help and having the door essentially slammed in their face. They go through months of heartache and trauma and eventually leave, disappearing into the night as if they were never there at all. And of course, it's easier for the church elders that way. It's easier to ignore the ongoing problem if the victims leave. But that's the beauty of this podcast, because you're giving a voice to all these people and you're giving them a space to tell their stories. And I feel like you, Peter, are the keeper of the stories, and you are boldly calling out the mistreatment of God's people. And I think this ministry is such a powerful thing because the problem of people being trampled by the church needs to be stopped. And to put it plainly, it's time for the church to pull the log out of its own eye.
Awesome. So I actually have a quick question before our final one. And I forgot to put this into the questions, but I think you can answer this pretty simply and pretty easily. Because the last question is talking to victims and their voice. But if you can talk directly to Marion, the session at Heritage CPC, the denomination as a whole, what would you tell them, knowing that they're likely going to hear about this almost the moment that it comes out, and they're going to be listening to this and can't say anything back to you or anybody else? They just have to listen. What would you tell them if they couldn't talk back?
You know, I've thought about that a lot. I still don't really know. I feel like I have a lot to say, but also nothing to say to them. Mm-hmm. I think that I know how much he wants to stand before God and to hear good and faithful servant. I mean, you know, we all do. But I think I would hope and pray that he would come to a greater understanding of God's love, and for women especially, and for children, and that he would repent for the mishandling of a lot of people's abuse situations, and that he would repent for being the pastor of the church where people have left the faith. My brother has. So, yeah, I don't know what else I would say, but just that I hope that he would come to know God's love more deeply, because I think there's a lot more love that God has than I think he realizes. So, yeah.
Good. That's from the heart. That's good. Last one. Always ending it with those who are hurting. You talk to those who may not have spoken up. We talked about the denomination and those who are within it, but can you talk directly to those who are either in your position or your friend's position who haven't spoken, who haven't said anything public, and are maybe listening to this and saying, well, maybe I can, but how do I? How do I have the courage to speak out about what's been happening? Because I've been told I'm in the wrong for years and years and years. And can I even do this if I'm the one who's being told by my church, the ones that I trust the most, that I'm at fault? So can you talk to those survivors and those who are not sure they have the voice to start speaking out?
I know it's tough. It really is, and that's such a good question. I will share some of the best advice that I received from a very wise woman. She encouraged me to find community in more than one place beyond just your church community, because if you have more than one support, because you need more than one support base. If something happens, it can make such a difference if you have somewhere else to fall back on, and that way you're not left with nothing. So if someone listening to this is considering making a change, just start by making friends or joining a group, a support group or a women's group or a men's group or a youth group outside of your current community. I know it's super scary and vulnerable, especially if you're an introvert, but it's worth it. It can be so healing, and it's worth it in the long run. And if you're not sure about all this, maybe you're going back and forth, which is totally fine. I went back and forth for a long time, but my decision became a lot easier once I asked myself this question. If the worst case scenario were to happen, if I was suddenly experiencing abuse in my marriage or something, would the elders be on my side? Would they help me? Or if I had a daughter who was being abused, would they help her? Once I realized that the answer was no, not really, my path became much clearer. And the other side of that, again, if you're feeling pulled in two different directions here, and it's just, it's scary, and it's just, I guess the advice I would give is to examine the authority figures over you. Our earthly authorities are representatives of our heavenly authority. And I think a way to be discerning is to ask, how does God exercise his authority over his people? Or almost, how does he parent us, so to speak? And if your earthly authorities are creating an environment of rules and restrictions, high control, high expectations of conformity, silencing, dismissing, shaming, and so on, then that is not Christ-like. That's not what I see of God's character. And that's not what we should see in our church elders. And so if you're being told to just submit or to just have more faith, I'm telling you, that is not what God wants for you. Jesus' work here on earth means that we are now free. Jesus worked against the culture of oppressive leaders, and he broke those barriers for us. To me, the story of the Bible and the work of Christ is that there is no one left behind anymore. There is no outcast, no person left uncared for, and no person outside of his love. The story of Christ is how he cares for all of his children, and he cares enough to bring us out of these oppressive environments.